Something was strange. Dan looked at his neighbor's garage. The door was open, and trash cans were spilling out onto the driveway. It wasn't like Kyle to leave doors open. Raccoons cause a lot of trouble in this neighborhood. He walked up to the house and noticed a newspaper on the lawn. That was a little unusual. Kyle ran every day and always stopped to pick up the newspaper. He also never left the front door open. Kyle was a theater technical designer and was constantly working with sound or lighting in his home studio. These projects often required silence or darkness, and for that reason, as well as the raccoons in the woods bordering their backyard, he had developed the habit of buttoning the house up tight unless he or Ginny went out into the yard. Dan knocked on the frame of the open door and called inside to see if anyone was home. Just as he was about to call to see if everyone was okay, he saw Kyle lying on the floor in the doorway of his studio. A small pool of blood had formed under Kyle's head. His face looked battered. His arm was bent backwards at a terrible angle, and bruises were visible in all the places not covered by clothing. Kyle had been beaten in his own home and left without help. Dan quickly dialed 911 on his cell phone while he called out for Jeannie. He managed to contain the adrenaline rushing through his veins long enough to give the 911 operator all the information he could, and then he rushed from room to room to make sure she wasn't lying in another room needing his help. She wasn't there. Dan had barely finished looking around the house when a police car pulled up with its lights on. An ambulance followed, and while the paramedics treated Kyle, the cops questioned Dan about what he had found. As Kyle was being taken to the emergency room, the only question on everyone's mind was, "Where is Jeannie?" Fade to black. Kyle and Ginny met in college. They were both in theater programs at drama schools in New York City, in the heart of one of the most active theater communities in the world. Ginny was studying to be an actress, learning how to create the illusion of a story on stage. She was great, but for some reason she had a hard time taking directions and preferred to give them. Her teachers noticed this and took notice of how creative her ideas could be. They began to prepare her for a career as a director or theater manager. Kyle was fascinated with the behind-the-scenes magic of theater. He didn't need to create illusions as an actor. He created different realities with sound, lights, effects, and his sets. He made it easy for the audience to believe in the actor's work. Kyle was immediately recognized as a genius. He was one of those rare talents who understands all aspects of technical theater, and he was as comfortable designing lighting as he was designing a sound story. They met when they were both hired to participate in a summer project in Connecticut the summer after their freshman year. Ginny had been invited there as a stage manager for her mentor and professor, who had just been hired as director for 2 of the company's 4 summer productions. Kyle had worked there the previous 2 summers as an electrician, and this year became assistant director of lighting and was given the opportunity to design one of the shows. Working closely together, the two immediately took a liking to each other. This will be the first of many productions together, both as students and as they build careers in the field. Ginny was slim and slender with a killer smile under her deep brown eyes. She was delightfully curvy in all the right places, but without a single speck of extra weight. Her long, tanned legs peeked out of the shorts she always wore, and her outerwear was conservative enough to say, "Please behave yourself," yet frank enough to say, "I may have a surprise for you." Kyle was very handsome. He was an avid runner and claimed that the best ideas came to him during his morning workout, when his brain was clear of the mishmash of everyday distractions. He looked like he exercised regularly, but in reality, he didn't need to. The daily lifting and climbing he had to do was a perfect substitute for the strength training his friends advocated. He was fit and trim, and was sure that if he continued to pursue his designs, even as a designer, he would remain so for life. For 2 weeks, they shouted to each other from remote corners of the theater, focusing lights, pointing special effects speakers, and calling lines before they were finally able to sit with each other. They had to program the signals on the light board, and as they sat together, became increasingly friendly. When they were done, Ginny leaned over and kissed Kyle on the cheek, saying that she really enjoyed working with him and that she looked forward to her work every day because of him. Kyle kissed her back, just not on the cheek. She responded, and their little tete-a-tete in the control booth got pretty hot. The door to the theater downstairs opened and slammed shut as the director walked in and called them in. "Kyle! Ginny! Are you guys done yet? We need to lock up." They quickly cleaned themselves up and descended from the stall. "It's all set, and you're going to love it," replied Ginny, coming down the stairs with Kyle well ahead of her, intent on hiding their little date. They started looking for opportunities to be together, but as filming began, time became precious. Ginny traveled with her professor every day from her apartment in town, while Kyle stayed home, a short drive in the other direction. One night, Ginny's professor didn't make it to the show, but stayed in town to celebrate her daughter's birthday. Ginny was supposed to be in charge, but she had no place to stay. Kyle had offered a guest room in his house. No one else was there since his parents were spending the summer on the Cape, so there was plenty of room. Ginny was thrilled. She didn't think they would need much space. One bed would be enough. By the time they reached his house, it was late. Ginny had fallen asleep in the car, and he didn't want to distract her by taking advantage of the fact that she was so tired. After all, she had become special to him. He didn't have feelings for her like he did for those superficial girls he picked up at a college party or one of the many theater parties after a play. So when they arrived at his house, he was the perfect gentleman, the perfect host. He led her to her room, at least the one where she was supposed to sleep, and made sure she was settled in. Then he snuck into his own room to rest. He would still have time for a visit the next day. He vaguely felt the door to his room open and someone lying in bed with him. Soft, slender arms wrapped around him, and the sweetest kiss he'd ever experienced lingered on his lips. It was good. Kyle? Kyle? Get Dr. Kenton, he's waking up. Kyle! His vision flickered, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room appeared before him. It was hard to focus, and he was completely confused. Only one eye was working. He tried to rise, but was held up, and immediately began to struggle against the restraints. Easy, easy, Kyle. You've been in rough shape, but we'll get through this. Don't fight us! We're on your side. He relaxed on the bed and looked at the post-op nurse who was talking to him. Dr. Kenton would be right there to explain everything. What's wrong with my eye? Kyle became alarmed when he realized his eye was heavily bandaged. He was badly hurt, but I must wait and let the doctor talk to you. Calm down, he'll be right with you. The doctor actually arrived very soon. He examined Kyle and talked about his injuries. Kyle was battered. His eye was bandaged as it had received at least one serious blow. The optical surgeon had repaired the detached retina, but the skull fractures around the eye socket also had to be repaired. He suffered a pretty severe concussion as a result of the blow that caused these injuries, and they were very relieved that he still had control of his speech. Kyle's arm was badly broken and was in a cast. He nearly died from a ruptured spleen and internal bleeding. If a neighbor had found him an hour later, he would not have survived. His nose and several ribs were broken. He had been unconscious for 2 days since he was found, and they were still trying to determine the time of the attack to figure out how long he had been lying unattended. I don't remember the attack. The doctor frowned and started asking Kyle questions. When he realized that Kyle couldn't remember any of the circumstances surrounding the weekend or the Friday before, he started asking general questions. As he finished, Dr. Kenton realized that Kyle couldn't remember anything that had happened since freshman year, before his encounter with Ginny. Kyle had suffered severe memory loss as a result of the attack, and only time would tell how soon she would return. Detective Porter, who had been assigned to investigate Kyle's case, was visibly disturbed. His chronology of the incidents leading up to the attack had hit a dead end last Friday when Kyle had disabled the home security system. Where had Jeannie been all this time? Shade of black. Senior year passed like a blur. Kyle saw Ginny regularly, and their love grew every day. By the end of the year, both had established careers, with Kyle working regularly as a designer for several small suburban houses and often backstage at theaters downtown for well-known designers. Ginny got a backstage job with a major opera company at Lincoln Center, a stable job with great benefits that she could keep for life. They rented a small apartment around the corner from her theater and enjoyed the bustling performing arts scene in the city. He remembered the tender moments they had spent together. She had decorated and shopped tastefully, and their apartment had been furnished so lavishly that it had become a popular hangout for their friends. He was a gourmet cook. Whether he cooked dinner for himself and company or just a candlelit dinner for the two of them, she always rolled her eyes in delight at his delicious cooking. Her eyes were rolling in bed too. Kyle woke up in a cold sweat, still lying in the hospital bed. Jenny. How Ginny fit into his life now. He had been told about the amnesia and how slowly it could come back. He had been told that these attacks would happen every once in a while, and he would almost relive his life as the oldest lost memories came back first. He wasn't prepared for how vivid the dreams would be and how much the thoughts of lovemaking would bother him. Previously, Kyle could only think of Ginny as a girl he knew from summer company, but now the memories of living with her came back to him. He really wanted to remember how she had fit into his life in the years that the concussion had taken from him. Where was Ginny now? Memories of their early life permeated his mind during the days that followed. Her advancement in her career eventually led to a position as stage manager at a very active suburban theater that put on plays and concerts. This company liked Kyle's work and often utilized his services. The couple succeeded financially and decided to get married. Now he could remember the wedding. The ceremony in the little church flashed before his eyes in minute detail. He could hear the small organ playing Bach, smell the distinct scent of beeswax candles burning at the altar, and his eyes watered at the sight of the smiling bride walking toward him. He could taste the delicious food in the little Greek restaurant where they had their wedding feast. They danced and then hugged family and friends as they traveled to the small inn where they were to spend their wedding night. Everything was beautiful. In the room, a fire burned in the brick hearth located right at the foot of their bed. They stood by the flickering flames and kissed. They swayed to music that wasn't there. With tenderness, he undid the buttons on her satin dress. As elegant as she looked in it, the glow of the fire further emphasized her nakedness. His body was beautiful, and she slowly approached Kyle, enclosing him in an embrace. He responded to her passionate kisses and pulled her down onto the bed. That night, they made love slowly, each taking time to get to know every inch of the other's body. They kissed every inch of each other, and when they finished making love, they stared at each other's faces for hours, dreaming of a long life together and old age. In the morning, they woke up the same way they had fallen asleep, face to face, looking at each other. Kyle woke up again in his hospital bed in a cold sweat. He still couldn't stay awake for long, but he always woke up feeling upset when his dreams included sex with Ginny. Why did he always wake up this way? Was he still married to Ginny? If so, where was she? He asked the nurse to tell him what they knew about him. "I can't do that," she replied. "I don't know enough about you to fill in the blanks. I can help you remember, but if I suggest something wrong, it could lead to more serious problems. Unfortunately, your concussion and eye condition require that you remain calm and quiet. Stress is undesirable right now, my friend." Dr. Kenton stopped by during his evening rounds. He was pleased to see that Kyle remembered events all the way back to his wedding, but there was still a 15-year gap between them. He agreed to give Kyle some information, but on the condition that Kyle would take it calmly. "You're still married to Jeannie, according to the neighbor who found you and saved your life. You still work as a freelance theater designer, and you're doing quite well. You have a beautiful home near this hospital. You and your wife have no children, but otherwise you are the stereotypical happy couple living the American dream." Now that Kyle looked more alert and sane, the doc spoke once again about the seriousness of Kyle's injuries. They were sure he would make a full recovery from everything. He went into detail about each injury, and Kyle heard nothing but blah, blah, blah. He didn't hear the answer to the question he wanted to ask, but could only think, "Where is Jeannie?" Ginny lay down on the dock by the lake. The water was cool on the fingers of her hand over the edge. Clouds hung overhead, slowly rolling over the hills that rose steeply on either side of the lake. She was in another world, far away from the city's rat race, from the constant demands of the snotty prima donna actors and musicians who came to perform on her stage. She was also far away from Kyle. She didn't know what to think of that realization. She was sure she still loved Kyle, but he was such a workaholic. He could never find time to relax, and his schedule was so tight that she just didn't feel that their time together was a priority. This little vacation with Steve was just what she needed. What could Kyle do to her? Divorce her? Fine! She looked over at Steve. He was standing on the beach, his back turned to her, kneading dumbbells in the sun, finishing his morning workout. Muscles bulged up and down his back, huge arms glistening with sweat. Steve had been a star college soccer player and had played several seasons in the NFL before injuring his knee. Now Steve ran a local chain of fitness clubs and kept his body so trim. He was smart about money and hired a manager who invested his NFL earnings in real estate. Who cared that he was dumb about everything but money? He couldn't sustain a conversation about anything but soccer and bodybuilding, But when he enclosed her in his arms, it was like something out of a dime novel. She fainted when he picked her up and carried her to the bed. Okay, Kyle, she pondered, get a divorce. We don't have kids, and look what I'll get. I'll be married to Mr. Universe. And I'll be Mrs. Universe. I'll trade the dusty theater for a gym where I can work out whenever I want, or spend all day admiring bodybuilders and lycra tights if I want. She couldn't wait for him to call. After Kyle had confronted them at the house when they'd left last Friday, she'd half expected to be wanted here by the bailiff with the divorce papers. She picked up her phone for the 100th time today to make sure it was working and ready for his call. The battery was charged. The signal was full, thanks to the convenient tower she'd spotted at the top of the hill. The ringer was on loud, but there were no calls from Kyle. They hadn't called her from work, as she'd arranged this week of vacation months ago. Kyle hadn't called in a week after begging her not to go with Steve. How could you beg someone for attention 1 minute and then not call for a whole week? And now it was Friday, and she hadn't heard from Kyle. She sat on the dock. Her naked body glistened from a week's worth of sunbathing all day and from visiting various wineries and taverns each evening. She loved the Finger Lakes. The evening sun illuminated everything around them so beautifully. Why did Kyle always insist on vacationing at the cottage on the Cape? No crowds, no small beaches, just the quiet solitude of the woods. Kyle again. She couldn't get rid of thoughts of him. Why hadn't he called? It was so strange. She sat down and dialed her home number. The message service answered. It wasn't pleasant to hear a recording of her own voice in response. She'd left a message in Kyle's box saying she'd be home early Sunday morning and they could talk then. When she hung up, she sat pensive, not letting go of the phone. Maybe there wouldn't be a divorce. Maybe Kyle would roll over on his back and beg her to come home. Yes, he will be on his best behavior from now on. Cooking clean and keeping her in a manner befitting a goddess. Oh yes, silly Kyle will fulfill her every whim while she runs around and enjoys the awesome body of her stud Steve. Kyle should be home. If he was angry, why hadn't he called? And if he wasn't angry, how did he feel? She knew he didn't have a show this weekend. He wasn't home. He hadn't called in a week or even sent a text. This was really weird. He was robbing her of the arguments she'd been mentally rehearsing since he'd left. She wanted this argument. She wanted to see his passion, and he didn't even satisfy her now. She called home again and this time entered the code for her personal message box, not the shared family box. It was full. The neighbors, Kyle's mom, and most disturbingly, Detective Porter were calling. Apparently, Kyle was hurt pretty badly. Apparently, his injury had gotten the attention of the police. Oh, God. Thoughts rushed through her head, but finally she remembered the last time she'd seen Kyle. Kyle knelt on the floor and begged her not to leave. He clung to her bag, assuring her that nothing could be so bad that she would leave like that without telling him. She had expected a more dignified response and thought this display unworthy of him. Honestly, I don't know how you can expect me to respect you as a man. Stand up and face facts. You don't treat me like I'm important, Steve does. You hoist light bulbs high up on the chimney, and Steve lifts me into bed in arms so strong it takes my breath away. You complain that I don't make passionate love to you anymore anyway, so what are you missing? I need a week. I need a vacation, but not on the Cape. I need to find out how another man can make me feel what it's like to be adored. She looked at him disdainfully as he sat back down. Steve stood in the doorway and chuckled softly. That made her chuckle too. Be a man. Let me go. If he doesn't step up, I'll come back next week and we can talk. Kyle let go of the suitcase. If you leave, everything will change. We'll never go back to the way things were. Why do you think the place we were in was so special? She grabbed her bag and headed out the door. I'll be right there, Steve said. I just need to say something to that little wimp. As Jeannie walked to the car, Steve approached a sullen Kyle who was kneeling in the hallway. Steve's massive hand guided his fist into the back of Kyle's skull. The beating was short but inconclusive. Since Kyle's face crashed into the baseboard from the first blow, he was unconscious from the start. He didn't feel Steve punching him in the gut or striking him with his fists. He didn't feel his spleen tearing, his bones breaking. Steve wanted to leave Kyle with a memory of intense pain so he would wake up. He left without closing the door, got in his car with Ginny and drove north to the lake. Ginny smiled the whole way. She remembered how she had met Steve last winter. Kyle had always stayed so trim and slim thanks to running and a lot of exercise at work. However, she had gotten a little fat and, although not obese, looked much closer to 40 than her husband of the same age. She signed up at Steve's gym and contracted him as her trainer. She still remembered the first time he had fumbled with her in the hot tub when the two of them were there. She had been so enchanted by his caresses that she had let Steve take her upstairs to his flat. It was unlike anything she'd experienced with Kyle. Kyle had gone on a business trip to oversee the touring company for his last show in Chicago and had been gone for a week. He'd even called her and fondly told her how much he'd missed her that first night, that very moment. Kyle hung up the phone with a quiet, "I love you." Jeannie also said, "I love you," though addressing Steve instead of Kyle. That week had sex with Steve until Kyle came home on Sunday, too tired from traveling to make love. That was good. Ginny woke up from her daytime reverie in alarm. She was concerned about Kyle's condition, for she really still loved him. She was also concerned about the ominous message left by Detective Porter, asking her to contact him about Kyle's beating. He wasn't calling to inform her of the attack, but rather that she was already aware of it. She saw the bulky figure of Steve finishing his push-up workout on a low-hanging branch. "Steve, what did you mean when you said it's settled? He's defeated?" Steve looked up. "What do you mean?" "Last Friday at my house, when we were leaving and you came out of the house following me, you said, 'It's settled. He's defeated.'" "What did you mean by that?" "Oh, just marking my new territory? I had to let him know who's boss. There's only one in charge in any pack, kid, and I'm going to make sure I'm yours." "Steve, what have you done?" "I punched him in the nose, got a little rough on him." "No big deal." "Steve, the police left a message on my answering machine. Kyle is badly hurt." "Not me, baby," Steve lied. "He was awake and moaning when I left. Maybe he got sick after he got drunk, or a mugger beat him up after we left. We have to go back." "No way," he replied. "We have 2 more days to sunbathe and drink, and 2 more nights to have sex." "Steve, this is serious. Kyle is badly hurt and the police will get suspicious that I wasn't there and I didn't make contact." "It won't be good if you hit him. He'll come in beaten up and we won't come back." "You want to trade 2 nights of sex for 2 years in jail?" She ran into the house and packed up both of them. When she came out, Steve was stowing his most important personal belongings, his dumbbells, in the trunk of the car. "Okay, maybe you're right," he said. "Let's go." They threw the bags in the trunk, locked the cab, and sped south. Fading to black. On Friday morning, the bandages were removed from Kyle's eyes. His body clock was finally free from the effects of the trauma and anesthesia from the surgeries. He was alert and flirting with the nurses. Repeated conversations with the police had so far yielded nothing, which was frustrating for Detective Porter. Kyle fondly remembered his pleasant home life with Ginny, his work on the show until about a year ago. He also remembered some big project involving his studio. Something to do with his recording equipment, something to do with sound effects. It kept him busy, but he couldn't figure out what it meant. He also remembered the intense pain. Somehow it was connected to the pain in his head, but he couldn't figure out how. He slept soundly on Friday night, knowing that he would be able to go home on Saturday. When Kyle was already asleep, Jeannie came home to a dark house. Steve carried her bag into the house, and they were both stunned to see a notice taped to the door stating that this was a crime scene, but it had been processed and the occupants could return. Entering the house, Ginny froze at the sight of a large puddle of dried blood on the floor in the hallway where Kyle lay. She looked at Steve. "Just a punch in the nose, huh?" Steve blushed. He might have gone a little overboard in his anger, and if he left Kyle in critical condition without help, he might be charged with something more than a simple assault. His mind searched for an explanation. He wasn't in his right mind, and he wasn't exercising a precision machine. "We can't tell the cops I hit him," Steve said. "We have to tell them that I left first, taking your bag to the car, and that he was fine when you left." "This is bad, Steve. This is really bad." "Ginny, stick to the story and everything will be fine. We'll look like heels for leaving and not being around him, but they won't be able to pin anything on us." "We?" Ginny was incredulous. "I was in the car." "Anything they put on you is going to be on your sorry hide, not mine. Breaking up with Kyle, even divorcing him, is one thing. Going to jail for beating him up is another." "You were with me, kid." And you heard me say he was defeated. You're in this with me. I may not be the smartest guy on the block, but I know what an accomplice is. She thought about it and realized that Steve was right. She wouldn't be able to explain their sudden departure unless they claimed they'd left Kyle in good shape, leaving the possibility that someone else had come along and beaten him up. How had she gotten into this mess in the first place? She agreed with Steve and they laid out their story. By the time they decided what to say, it was almost midnight. She called Detective Porter and he said he would meet them at the police station immediately. The case was urgent and couldn't wait until morning. Ginny wanted to go to the hospital first, but Detective Porter insisted. He told her that Kyle had been medically discharged and was most likely resting. He pointed out that she had taken her time to visit Kyle when he was in critical condition, and even today she had gone home instead of going straight to the hospital. There was no reason to disturb his peace, so necessary to his recovery. But there were questions that needed to be answered. Ginny answered nothing until the detective suggested that the patrolman pick her up and drive her. He and Steve got into the car and drove to the station. They were questioned separately, but both had already rehearsed their story. They didn't tell much, relying on, "I don't know." They admitted that they had been in the house and had seen Kyle. They admitted that he was very upset when they left, but physically he was unharmed. Porter didn't believe them, but he had no evidence to back up his hunch. He knew that Kyle was being discharged from the hospital today, so he decided to keep both of them in the isolation room until Kyle got settled and until Porter could alert him that his wife was coming home. Besides, it might give Steve and Ginny a chance to believe that the other had blabbed and given away the truth, and maybe get them to talk more freely. Porter waited for Dan, Kyle's neighbor, to bring him home. Kyle cautiously made his way outside, still very sore from the savage attack. He waved for Porter to come into the house. Dan's wife Kim had come in earlier and cleaned up the hallway. The house was nice and inviting and smelled good. She smiled as she came out of the kitchen and invited everyone to the table for a home-cooked dinner. While Kyle appreciated Kim's efforts, especially cleaning up the reminders of the incident, he was uncomfortable being at home. He coldly recalled the events of the past week, up until the day of the incident, and the absence of those last fragments upset him. Kim and Dan cleaned up the kitchen and said goodbye. They agreed with the other neighbors that they would check on him every hour or two and make sure he was okay, at least for the weekend. They assured him that if he needed anything, he should call right away. As they were leaving, Detective Porter looked at Kyle and said, "She'll be home soon, you know that?" "I know. She's been here before." Kyle nodded at Ginny's bag by the door. "I know. I held them off today to make sure you're okay and ready to meet her. He'll probably be with her." "I'm ready." Detective Porter noted the determination in Kyle's voice and the resolve in his eyes. "I want to show you something." Kyle led Porter into his studio. Porter was impressed with the abundance of sound, digital imaging, and computer equipment in the room. Kyle led him over to a computer workstation connected to a large mixing console. "This is my main sound recording setup. I have a lot of interesting files here. Some of them I'd forgotten about until just a minute ago when I remembered. One memory has been plaguing me for the last day or two. Something had to do with a project I was working on but couldn't remember. When Dan and Kim left, it reminded me of another couple leaving the house. The one that left the house last Friday just before I was attacked. I may have been recording something when they came to call and didn't turn off the recorder. Perhaps there is an audio file here that will explain the situation to you if something happened to me. I may have recorded everything from the time Ginny and Steve left here until the recording reached the limit, which was set at 12 hours. I have to take this to our lab." "I wish you wouldn't do that. I'd be happy if you'd let me fight my own battles." Detective Porter considered Kyle. He wasn't suspicious. He didn't need to be, because he knew Kyle intended to repay the spanking and humiliation Steve had lavished on him the previous week. "Kyle, I love to watch a good bare-knuckle brawl, but unfortunately I will have to arrest both participants and witnesses. I also love to watch an outsider come back strong and take back what he lost. Steve is a big guy and he trains hard in this gym. It doesn't matter. Hey, what I don't know won't hurt me. Just give yourself time to heal longer." Kyle nodded. Detective Porter wished him the best and made sure Kyle put his phone number on the speed dial list of his cell phone. Fade to black. That evening, Steve brought Ginny home from the county jail. Her hair was disheveled and her clothes were disheveled. They both entered the house, but Steve waited by the door, and she walked alone into the living room. "Hi," she said meekly. Kyle just stared at her with an absent expression. "I heard you were hurt, so I came home early." Everything inside him was exploding. He wanted terribly to leap out of his chair and berate her for her feigned concern, for coming home 2 whole days early from a trip he shouldn't have taken to have an affair he didn't understand and couldn't approve of. But outwardly he showed only calmness. That's right. She was surprised at the lack of emotion on his part. After he'd begged her to stay, crying and covering her bag, she'd expected more. "Are you okay now?" "I'll be healed." "We have to talk." "No, we don't. We talked last week." "Kyle, we can't just let this fester in our minds. You need to discuss this with me. I need to know what to expect. Expect separation and then divorce. Expect you to walk away from me and never be accepted back. Expect me to treat you with the respect any other person deserves, but without the love and care I felt for you a week ago." It was partly as she had expected, but she hadn't expected him to be so calm and unflappable. So she would stay for a couple days and then move out once she got her affairs in order. She set her bag down and turned to sit down. "I said you were leaving." She turned to look at him in bewilderment. "I meant now. Go." "I don't think you understand what's going on here. I may have hurt you. I may have ruined our marriage, but I have given no rights to my house or property. I will move into the guest room, but I will stay here until I pack up my things and move out of here." Before she could continue her tirade, Kyle flicked the remote in his hand. The stereo system he'd installed throughout the house switched on and played a recording of last Friday's events. It was clearly audible as she wryly belittled him, saying that she was going on holiday with a real man and that he couldn't stop her. It was heard Steve laughing as she told Kyle that she planned to have sex with Steve all week, if not longer, until she was satisfied. Kyle begged her to stay and sort things out, whimpering pitifully and trying to hold onto her bag. As she left, her heels clicked noisily on the floor, and Steve said, "Tough luck for the little wimp." After the door slammed shut, there was the sound of the door opening and Ginny called out in the distance, "Come on, Steve." He withdrew, and then could be heard saying to Kyle, "Just so you don't get any ideas of following us or trying to stop us." This was followed by the sound of Steve beating Kyle. Steve could be heard grunting as he delivered numerous blows to Kyle's ribs, and even worse was hearing him taunting Steve, telling him how he was going to beat the crap out of him tonight. As he walked away, Steve left a parting look. "Now your head is as broken as your feeble heart. Lie in your blood and think for an hour or two. You'll realize she needs a big dog to make her happy. But she'll come back to you when she realizes that a big male dog can't stay with one bitch for long." Kyle looked at an exhausted Ginny. Steve appeared in the doorway, looking at Kyle with a frown. "Why, you sneaky little coward?" Kyle stopped him by waving a finger. "Porter doesn't have the tape. But he'll get it if I want him to. I don't want him to put you in jail. I want a second fight." Ginny was horrified. Steve grinned from ear to ear. "I'm proposing a bet. You both have to agree and your terms will be different, or there will be no deal, and Porter will get the sound file in 10 minutes via email. In 6 weeks, as soon as the cast comes off my arm and my ribs heal." "You can't win." Steve shook his head. "No, I couldn't win after that cheap shot last week. This time we're going to fight fair and square. No sneaking up from behind and cold stabbing an unsuspecting victim. You coward. You'll see me coming and you won't be able to stop me the way I was able to stop you lying unconscious last week. Are you sure you can win on those terms? With your bare hands, man to man, no weapons? I'll tear you apart. Bet on your gym." Steve looked at him again. He wasn't willing to take a risk on this scale. He owned the gym and the building it was in. There were several offices in the building that were profitable tenants, and it was an incredible cash cow. His apartment occupied the top floor of the building and was a luxurious space overlooking Long Island Sound. But Steve didn't believe this guy could be anything but a competitor to an athlete like him. Sure, David had defeated Goliath, but David had the slingshot. Bet all your gyms. Steve paused, reflecting on his burgeoning business. Not only did he have a flagship club, but he had 6 branches across the city, and they were thriving to the point where he was thinking of selling the franchise. What, put all that against your house and all that fancy electronic equipment? Are you out of your mind? No, my house and equipment are not for sale. You're putting this record and all copies on the line. You're staking jail time and the loss of all your assets later in civil court. You're putting your business, your real estate on the line. A silence hung in the room as Steve realized he was going to have to fight for his freedom. And your cars. Steve had several vintage and late model Corvettes, one from each decade starting in the 50s. They were his pride and joy, and the whole town knew it. The stakes were incredibly high, but Steve thought Kyle was nothing. Done. And the lake house? Okay. All the cards are in your hands, aren't they? I'll risk everything. But there's really no risk. I'll grind you down. Kyle looked at Ginny. She had listened to him rolling stakes for Steve, and now she was getting ready to hear her take her chances. If I win, I want everything and for you to leave. Not to contest the divorce, not to take anything from this house or our cottage, not a dime from our bank account or investments. You have to watch every minute of the fight. You also have to live with Steve until the fight, and if I win, for a whole year afterward. Ginny flinched but nodded in agreement. She knew Steve was strong. But she also knew what kind of shape Kyle was in, how much he ran. She'd seen him handling spools of cable and pipes backstage that usually required two people to move. Kyle? He looked at her with the same blank expression, and she felt bad again that she couldn't understand him. What if I'd rather bet on you? You already made that choice last week. This week your choice is freedom or prison. Fade to black. The weeks passed quickly, and Kyle spent them recovering his strength. He started doing lighting projects again. His absence from the scene had left a bit of a void, and his return was welcomed. At every turn he was asked about the attack, but he refused to give details. The circumstances surrounding his wife were the source of many rumors. It was widely known that she was now living with Steve. There were those who suspected the truth and waited to see what Kyle would do. He was known for his stubbornness, and none of these people believed that he would begrudgingly endure the beating and kidnapping of his wife. The stories of Jeannie abandoning Kyle in his hour of greatest need and the fact that he was so well loved made her a pariah in the theater community. It was the night of the fight. Kyle entered the gym in a t-shirt and sweatpants. Steve was already at the ring, wearing ridiculous-looking boxer shorts and a t-shirt with the gym's logo on it. Jeannie sat sullenly at the table, holding an envelope containing Steve's titles and contracts, his betting stakes. Steve was surrounded by many of his friends, as well as the staff and clients of the gym. They were all cheering him on, encouraging him, and teasing him about the easy job he had ahead of him. They clamored even more when Kyle entered the room. Kyle, with his light runner's body, looked unimportant compared to Steve's bulging, strong body. Kyle walked past Jeannie and placed his folio of contracts and records on the table next to Steve's desk. Climbing into the ring, he said, "Let's go! No calls, no referees, no stoppages until one of us is defeated." Steve smirked, snuck to the ropes, and held out his hand to Kyle. Kyle looked at it, and without taking it, delivered a punch to Steve's nose. Steve looked up stunned, a trickle of blood flowing from his right nostril. "No bells," said Kyle, biting Steve again. Steve's imposing physique made him look impressive, but he wasn't as flexible as Kyle. His stiff frame slowed his reaction time, and he moved worse than Kyle. Steve ran after Kyle but couldn't get his big body to react fast enough to pin down the speedy Kyle. Every time he got close enough to land a punch, Kyle made him pay for it with a flurry of jabs to the face. Soon Steve's face was swollen and he slowed down his attempts to corner Kyle. Steve soon realized that his position was no better in the center of the ring. Kyle didn't look that big, but he was also a short man and had a significant advantage in punching distance. Plus, he kept up the pace while Steve was tiring from a lot of punches, the best of which barely reached their target. As Steve tired, Kyle began to throw punches to his body. It wasn't long before Steve's arms grew heavy and drooped. Kyle pulled him apart. "That's enough, Steve. You can barely stand. You can't defend yourself. You've lost." Steve stared at him, breathing hard. Both eyes were swollen shut, his nose was bleeding, and there was a nasty cut under the only eye that could still see. "Surrender now, and I'll leave you more than you deserve. Apologize to everyone. Give it up now, and I'll take this hall, this building, and the 58 convertible. You keep the rest? If you don't give up now, I'll knock you out and keep everything. Steve knew he was defeated. His head was already down as his body sank to its knees. I apologize. Kyle walked over to the desk and pulled out the paperwork for the building, the gym, and the title to the 58 vet. Taking the keys in his hands, he looked around at the disbelieving gathering of Steve's friends and associates. I'm closing the gym and opening a theater school here. I will honor the employment contracts you have with Steve, but will expect you to work for me in a useful capacity. If he transfers you to one of his other gyms, I will release you from your contractual obligations here. For those of you who rent the building, I will honor the terms of your contracts and negotiate fairly when they are up. However, there will be a different atmosphere here, as this space will be converted into a theater. If you choose to cancel your lease due to these changes, I will release you. Ginny stared at Kyle incredulously. They had long dreamed of creating a community of theater professionals and enthusiasts dedicated to the advancement of the theater arts. Not only was he realizing their dream without her, but he had the means to do so thanks to her betrayal. She felt completely abandoned. She suddenly felt very lonely and cold. The color disappeared from her face, and she stared at a battered Steve. There wasn't a drop of pigment on his face, already blackened with bruises and reddened with blood from the cuts his friends had only bandaged. Steve had never looked so pathetic, so broken. Kyle had never looked so brave. There was no gloating or arrogance in him, just the cold confidence with which he did everything. Fade to black. 6 months later, Ginny was still living with Steve. After the fight, neither of them were interested in the other sexually. Nevertheless, they had to live together as part of their bet. It was a tepid coexistence, as each saw the other as the cause of the failures in their destiny. Ginny quickly and quietly moved out of her house, which was now completely Kyle's. The divorce had been finalized a long time ago. Kyle hadn't spoken to her since the fight and didn't answer the phone when she tried to call. Steve continued to build his business, but growth slowed when words spread about his failure in the ring. He saved what he had by offering season ticket packages aimed at seniors and moms who didn't work out outside the home. 2 of his satellite gyms closed and the rest lost their glamour. He'd lost his penthouse when his building was taken over by Kyle and had been forced to move into a small apartment next to one of the remaining gyms, which now served as his flagship. Now his swagger wasn't as cocky and often wasn't even present at all. Instead of the aura of confidence he had exuded before the whole Kyle episode, he seemed much less menacing. His mood was often sullen, and he was constantly worried about finances, as he no longer received rent from his downtown building to support his other businesses. Kyle successfully converted the main gymnasium into a great theater space. He converted smaller areas into rehearsal spaces, stores, and dressing rooms. He carved out space for a small, intimate cabaret theater and opened a coffee shop with a small stage on the 2nd floor. The summer season was already planned, and the town was buzzing with excitement about the opportunities Kyle offered for actors and audiences of all ages. As expected, Kyle had been so consumed with setting up store that it seemed as if he had forgotten about the entire attack that had taken place a partial year ago. But he still remembered everything clearly. He remembered every night when he walked through his own front door. He remembered every night when he fell asleep in his lonely room. He remembered every time he walked into the theater where he and Ginny were working on a project. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the memory that they had been together half their lives and still didn't know the woman he thought was the love of his life. One evening, he was working on a light story in his studio when the doorbell rang. It was Ginny's brother, Peter. Peter lived in Boston and rarely left the city. In all the time he and Kyle had been together, he had only visited Ginny twice. His presence meant something was wrong. Hey, Kyle. I'm sorry to bother you, but I really need to talk to you about my sister. Would you mind if I came in? Sensing the urgency in Peter's words, Kyle stepped aside and escorted him into the living room. He offered him a cup of coffee or a beer, but Peter declined. I'd really like to get to the reason I came to see you. I'm very sorry things have gone so badly between you two. I thought you two were a wonderful couple, and I want you to know that our entire family was shocked by my sister's sudden change of heart. She's determined to hold up her end of the bargain. She realizes she was stupid to give you up for an affair. But her life with Steve just isn't right. She chose Steve over me, Kyle muttered. It just seemed appropriate that she get exactly what she wanted. She chose to have an affair. She made a mistake and betrayed you brutally, and no one blames you for how you reacted. She did a stupid thing, but life with Steve is torture, and now he's also given her physical strength. He hit her and broke her nose last night. Kyle hated to hear that Ginny was being abused. He wanted her to come to terms with Steve's stupidity, his early American style of dress, his life as a gym rat. He wanted her to be disgusted by Steve's sexist comments and expectations, his selfish attitude, his inexhaustible vanity. "Take me to her," he said to Peter. "She's in the car." "She doesn't want to come in. She's too proud. She didn't want me to come in and she's really mad. I just want you to release her from her promise to live with Steve for a year. She doesn't even want to do it, but I think he'll hurt her more next time." Kyle slowly stood up and headed for the door. Peter followed right behind him. "Please talk to her gently, Kyle. She's been through hell, and though she brought it on herself, she's suffered enough already." Kyle walked over to the car and opened the door. "Please come in," he said to Ginny. "We need to talk." Ginny reluctantly but slowly got out of the car. She walked into the house and Kyle whispered to Peter, "She'll be fine. Go to Steve's and get her things and bring them back here." Kyle led Ginny into the kitchen. A flood of memories came over her. Kyle hadn't changed a thing. Everything smelled the same, looked the same, felt like home. The only difference was that all of her pictures were gone. Kyle had replaced them with pictures of her family. Tears came to her eyes, for to be cut out of her home like that was just awful. She'd considered it her home since she hadn't had time to get a new one yet, and she'd considered life with Steve a temporary hell. She wasn't replaced, just cut out of this place she had once loved. Kyle was well aware that she was crying, and although he was touched by the woman who was still the greatest love of his life, he didn't go to Ginny. Instead, he poured her a cup of coffee and made her coffee the way she had always liked it. He made her coffee like no one else, not even Ginny herself. The smell of the steaming brew in the mug and the perfect blend brought her back to herself, reminding her once again how perfect her husband and the life she had left behind were. "You're moving away from Steve. Peter is picking up your stuff now. You're going to move in here. You can stay in the little apartment we built over the garage. You'll be independent. When you get well again and start working, you can move out whenever you want. If you want, I'll find you a job at my new store. If you decide not to move out, you can stay here as long as you want. I do not wish to witness any romantic relationships of any kind, although I intend to bring dates home if I wish. I expect you to take good care of your apartment, show care for my property, and respect our neighbors and guests. These are the only terms of living here. There will be no rent. No expectations or promises of any relationship other than a promise to observe decorum. Somewhere inside of me, I will always love you. Elsewhere, I'll always be afraid of what's in you that could have betrayed me the way you did. I didn't want Steve to bully you, so I don't expect you to finish your year with him." She swallowed back a tear and looked into Kyle's eyes for the first time in months and thanked him. She mumbled something about moving in with Peter, but Kyle reminded her that the New York theater scene was her life, and she couldn't exist without it for long. She realized that he was right and agreed to move in. "Wait here. I'm going to help Peter. Make yourself at home." The significance of his last statement was music to her ears. Fading to black. Kyle pulled up behind Peter's car. He walked straight to Steve's house as if he were his master. Steve didn't like it, but there was nothing to object to. He had hit Jeannie, and now he found himself here with her brother and the guy who had publicly flogged him. Either of them could have sent him to jail for abuse, and Peter was using this moment as a slave driver. Steve carried Ginny's things to the car. Peter helped him pack, but it was Steve who carried the stuff. There wasn't much stuff, as the terms of the divorce agreement left her with only a couple mementos and clothes. Steve returned to the house after the last trip. He began to talk. "Don't say a word." Kyle was seething with rage. "You know what's about to happen now, don't you?" Steve didn't want to hear it. "You broke her nose. You hit a little woman and ruined her face by breaking her nose. Stand up." Steve looked at him, but obediently stood up. Kyle stood up as well. He stepped up close to Steve, and before Steve or Peter could anticipate what would happen, Kyle broke Steve's nose with a swift right punch. Shade of black. 3 years later. Jeannie is still living in Kyle's apartment. She's not dating, but is thinking about starting. She is one of Kyle's most valued colleagues, working as a manager, director, and teacher at his theater center. She considers Kyle her best friend and respected boss. She has written a play that has been successful in regional theaters and published by a major publisher. She is financially independent and is becoming like the old Ginny. The fact that Kyle had welcomed Ginny back into his life was taken as a signal by his neighbors, his family, and the theater community. She was accepted in those circles in almost the same status as she had been all those months ago, though no one had forgotten where she had been. Steve sold his business and after some reflection found that he didn't like what a jerk he had been. He eventually found a use for his college degree in physical education by taking a job at a local elementary school. He became passionate about working with children with physical disabilities and other special needs. He became a Special Olympics coach and volunteered in the physical therapy department at a local children's hospital. Kyle's theater project has flourished, and his programs have been accredited by the local university. His programs for high school students are highly regarded and have become very profitable. His professional productions pack full houses and attract the attention of New York's top critics, who usually don't stray far from Broadway theaters. Kyle and Ginny lived close to each other, but they rarely spoke to each other. Although he took care of her when she needed help, he did so out of a sense of responsibility. She was the love of his life, and he couldn't see her in utter shambles, beaten down and rejected by the society that ran the profession she lived for. Having gotten her into a safe place, he wanted nothing more from her. He dealt with her professionally, after all. She was good at what she did and was a great asset to his company. However, he couldn't see her in any other light and rarely interacted with her even on a friend level. Jeannie accepted her position in Kyle's life as a blessing. She wasn't in jail, she was working, and she could at least make it up to Kyle in some small way. It seemed to her that living next to him with no chance of him ever loving her again was better than the alternative. It was impossible to truly make it up to him, but perhaps if she stayed here until she saw him happily settled with a new love and perhaps a family, she could find peace. It was inevitable. Kyle had fallen in love with a divorced woman he'd met on the Cape. She lived in a neighboring cottage with her brother's family and young daughter. She moved in with Kyle in the fall, and in October they were married in a beautiful but small ceremony in the backyard of Kyle's house. Ginny declined the invitation to attend the ceremony, but watched the proceedings from her bedroom window, the only window that had a view. She cried bitter tears as she recalled the events that had brought her to this moment, and now the last chapter was complete. Tears fell on the last small suitcase. The rest she had already loaded into the rental car parked outside the garage. When everyone had gathered at Kyle's house for dinner, Ginny picked up her bag and got into the car. Before she drove off, she took one last look at Kyle's house. She knew he would find the goodbye letter she had left on his desk as soon as she returned from her honeymoon. She checked her bag one more time to make sure she had her ticket, passport, and signed contract for her new job as a stage manager in London. Kyle had a new life now. She shed one last tear and set off to find hers.